like this, man. It's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like, it's like that, man. That's the wind, man. Or like a dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all time.
All right, Alexander Adams, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. We seem to have overcome our technical difficulties, and we seem to be firing on all cylinders.
Our technical difficulties have been almost, at this point, almost legendary. We actually recorded roughly half of another podcast, and then a giant tree fell on the power line to my house, and I lost power for 18 hours. It turns out it's remarkably difficult to finish a podcast when you are doing everything by candlelight. So got that sorted. The sky is clear. It seems as if there's no more storms planned. So I'm really glad to have you back on, hopefully, for our last version of this podcast.
Let's hope so. For this one, maybe in future there'll be more. But yeah, looking forward to getting this one down on tape.
Definitely. So it's weird sort of starting our conversation over again right after a few days, but you have a book which is coming out on the day that this episode will be out. So first of all, could you describe, who you are and what you do, and then maybe lead into the book that you've written?
So I'm a London-born, British-based artist, and I've been working in this area for 30 years. Both writing and making art, but recently I've pushed to write less and to make more art, and that caused me to think a lot about what was driving me, what my priorities were, what my goals were, how I was serving other people, how I was being true to myself, how I was getting my art out in the world, and that forced me to think about a lot of assumptions that I had. So this book, the new book, which is called How to Start a Dissident Art Movement, which is out today, coming out initially through imperiumpress.org, and it will later be available through Barnes & Noble and Amazon and all the other, and good independent bookshops as well. So this was written for me sort of to confront and consider what it was to be an artist after a long period of perhaps spending too much time writing. So the paradoxical thing, of course, is I wrote a book about what it is to be an artist. And that's what has been at the center of my being for the last 2-3 years, since I got married. We talked and made a decision. We talked about, well, what do you really want to do with your life? What are you best at? And now I've got to sort of step up to the mark and do the things that I've always been capable of doing, but I've never achieved through sort of personal situations and inhibitions and also circumstances as well. But the main thing I say about this in this book is that if you want to do amazing things, if you want to be a brave artist, you can't rely on the people around you, and you can't rely on circumstances around you. You have to make the changes within yourself before you make an impression on the world, and you start, putting yourself out there. So that's what I've been up to.
So yeah, there are several things. There's several things I want to discuss. First of all, being both an artist and a dissident, because one of the most aggravating things to me, really just ever, but is the sort of like, I guess, kind of tactical use of dissidents, right, by the regime, right? So they're sort of pet artists who get to play pretend as if they're fighting the system, speaking truth to power, but really they are completely and totally owned, right? They are like Hemingway, basically getting shuffled around by the Communist Party, getting, fed cocktail drinks, or, they are, Rage Against the Machine, right? Who's fighting the system while charging, $400 and $500 for a nosebleed seats at a concert. And so how would you define, I guess, the relationship between, a truly dissident spirit and an artist? Because oftentimes artists are sort of given that fake dissidence almost as a reward.
Yeah, it's performative, and that's something that you look at when you see people who are in the system at the moment. In Britain, we have an artist called Banksy, who's a sort of left-wing artist, street artist, and he does stuff, sprayed on walls, and it's sort of quite interventionist. And in some ways, it can be quite witty, but everything that he's pushing at an open door. He's sort of saying, "Oh, sort of policemen are thugs, and little children, they know more about the world than adults, and or you crusty British people, when you object to immigrants, then you basically you're just being."
It's the ideology of John Cleese, right? Who, admittedly, I think is funny, but
yeah,
these are ideas that were cutting edge. I mean, when my grandparents were young, right? So sorry, continue.
No, that's absolutely it. So what's happened is you also find this with feminists, that they've got sort of a trace memory, like a founding mythos, that dissidents and rebels on the left, and they're fighting against the system and the patriarchy, and it's and it's a big old system designed to favor white people and men and stuff. And this was something that was sort of, it might have been true. It wasn't set up that way, but it might have been true, 100 years ago, at a push, maybe 70 years ago, 60 years ago, maybe. But it's not been that way for a very long time. But the mythos has continued, and you've had new generations being educated by older generations. And so this truism has been passed down, generation after generation, and it's not been true for a very long time. So you find that to be a real dissident, you're having to say things that are actually in line with old teachings, with ancient teachings. Even sort of the teaching of ancient society, not just what was happening in the 19th century, but a lot older, when you're talking about fundamental basics of what it means to be human, what it is to make a community, what it is to support your kith and kin, what it is to serve your God, if you have a God. And those seem to be extreme retrograde positions, but actually I think these are constant positions, and they have been constant positions for thousands of years, and wouldn't have been considered at all controversial. They're only controversial now.
Well, this is an interesting dynamic. So look, biographical detail necessary for the conversation. I promise it won't turn into a blog post. I spent a lot of time in school around art school kids, right? Just due to kind of the structure of the university that I was in. The art school was housed, in a similar area to where I went for my classes. And so those were the people I spent a lot of time with, right? And so because of that, I was sort of comfortable in those circles. I spent a lot of time with them. And I thought it was interesting to watch art as sort of almost taught as a canon, right? Where there was a way to learn how to be an artist. And obviously, if we look at, the Western tradition, it was sort of a trade, right? You would have, from a certain perspective, right? You would have, your apprentices. There are a great number of prominent artists who began as, the student of someone else, basically blocking out the boring background details the master didn't feel like painting. And so you could look at that and say, well, there's training there. And obviously there's still training, but I think there's a fundamental difference in, the 4-year college degree and how that affects the creative process. So I'm curious, do you have thoughts about how art as a degree you can purchase for, X number of, $1,000 has sort of affected, how art exists in modern society?
Yeah, well, actually, my background's really interesting. I think people are going to, when people look at what happened to me and what happened to my story, they're going to look at it and say, well, this is really interesting. This is the turning point. Okay, so I went to art college in London in the 90s, early 90s, just after the wave of artists called the Young British Artists. So this was Damien Hirst and Sarah Lucas and Tracy Emin and stuff. And they're not so big now in international circles, but, Damien Hirst has still got quite a big name. And so he had been Goldsmiths. And so we were coming in straight afterwards, and we were kind of like, we were sort of super cool, and we didn't want to name check him, and we didn't want to mention him, and we didn't want to talk about, the Sarah Lucas exhibition or any of that sort of stuff. But it was all on our mind, and we were all going to see this art, but we were like too cool for school. We weren't going to actually say it, but we wanted exactly what they'd have. We wanted the big shows. We wanted the international status. We wanted to win the Turner Prize, which at the time was, like a big contemporary art prize in Britain. It was the biggest prize you could have, and there was lots of publicity. And we were like, nah, I wouldn't do that, man. I wouldn't even take it if it was offered. But we were like, damn, how do we get in there? So I did that, and I was taught things by my teachers, and I also absorbed things from what was going on, because I used to go to a lot of contemporary art exhibitions when I was in London, because it was hub of the art world, right? Early 90s, quite an exciting place. And I picked up all the lessons that wouldn't apply. So you were taught, okay, if you want to be an artist, you go to the best art school. And I was actually at the best art school in the world at the time. You do cooperative shows, you do group shows, you do open shows. Then you move up to a small indie gallery and you do cooperative spaces. And then you have your first solo show, and you have like an independent commercial gallery, and they'll be sort of edgy, and they'll get you into these places. Then you'll go to the bigger regional museums, and then you'll go up to the Tate, which is the top museum in Britain, and you'll go up, and this is a career ladder. And all of this time you'll be doing more interviews, and you get in reviews, and you get teaching posts, and then you get Arts Council grants, and then you get international touring shows, and and you were taught that this was your ladder. You weren't taught exactly how you would make the art, but it was kind of assumed that, this was only for a lucky few, the people who were really dedicated. So you'd sort out the actual art stuff, but this was the career stuff. And I was taught that, and I absorbed it. And because I didn't quite know how I was going to negotiate the world ladder, and I grabbed hold of it, and I was still hanging on to it like 2 or 3 years ago, even though it had been 20 years out of date. By the year 2000, the early 2000s, the whole game had changed. The internet had come in. Commercial galleries had kind of scattered and exploded. Lots of routes into public museums were no longer open for you, because your artists were being selected on demographic characteristics or political characteristics. They weren't being selected on the work. And there were all sorts of other things that you were not taught about art. So, for example, there's a really good book called Why Artists Are Poor. And it's a university study, and it's a study of the economics, and it's a study also of the mindset of an artist, and the way art is a unique luxury good, but there's all sorts of things about it that are not properly explained and never explicitly stated. So there's this idea that you've got to disdain material things, you've got to disdain wealth and riches and titles and stuff, but at the same time, it's really useful for you. You need it, and it's helping you to establish a proper life, a professional life. It helps you get money. It makes you secure. It gets you into museums. It turns you into part of the canon, which you just mentioned. But you're not taught all of these things. They're kind of secret knowledge, and they're kind of even secret knowledge when you're a student. And there's all sorts of rules and stuff that I picked up on. And I grabbed hold of this ladder, this career ladder, and it had all gone by the time it really was important to me. So I spent 20 years hanging on to this ladder, trying to work out what was good. There was a rung missing. I just wasn't being able to step up the way I'd been taught. My tutors had had pretty similar background to me. They'd gone to good schools. They were from sort of middle class families. They went to good art schools, and then they started doing the things that I'd started doing. But then they'd gone up higher than me, and I was not progressing, and I didn't understand what was going on. And the whole thing was that I had absorbed a structure and a system that was completely wrong and didn't work anymore. and perhaps in a way never properly worked entirely as it was explained to us then. But anyway, it's a complex series. So that's how I ended up doing quite well, but also doing catastrophically badly as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, that because you see the same thing very much so in publishing, right? That look like, okay, the industry had a certain amount of baseline corruption to it, but there was this idea of, there's a ladder, right? You may start, at the sports writing desk, you it's something kind of, formulaic, but you work your way up. You send your great manuscript off to New York, and now you're a novelist, right? You've got a New York Times bestseller. And I think because so many of our guys are writers, we've been exposed to the corruption in that industry, right? I can't remember if it's Newbery or another one of the fairly, let alone what they did to the, the prominent sci-fi awards, right? Where, since the year 2000, I think there's been one male millennial author to receive a prominent book award. White male, author to receive a book award, which, like, okay, sure, there might be some demographic change in that, but not one, right? They were just based off of just even a normal distribution. And so very clearly those have broken down. And some of it is an active choice, right? Some of it is this kind of decision to, lock certain people out of, certain avenues to success, sort of out of like, desire to set right some kind of original sin or, punish the outsider, whatever. But I think also there very much is and you see this with creatives as well, right? That the kind of like social bounty, the kind of surplus that enabled a lot of people to live very well was a very concentrated thing. And once it was gone, it was gone. And so, when you talk about, how people talk about, how artists should disdain material wealth. One of the things that I've noticed is there's actually quite a lot of artists who are able to have that attitude because they have very rich parents. And once you sort of get let in on the game, you're like, wait a minute. You're not poor. You're pretending to be poor. So for instance, right, I think of, people I went to school with, right, who were very, very progressive, serious people, right? Someone who went to school during the, the summer of Floyd, very concerned about, racial inequities. And then I learned that, their father was a prominent orthopedic surgeon, right, who had invented, a new technology for reconstructing hips, was worth, tens of millions of dollars. And her family owned a plantation where slaves used to live. Like a very beautiful southern plantation. You're like, well, okay, this is weird, fundamentally coming from different places. And that's sort of a cliched remark. But I think even with, the previous generation, right, the boomers, coming from a time of surplus where the things that they took for granted, right, the amount of margin they had to create and the amount of access they may not have realized they had has changed for people who've come after them. So, sorry, that was a little bit of a rant. I feel like I complain about art school people enough. But if you spend any time around them, you'll understand the urge to complain about them. But one of the things that I want to talk about is sort of, your advice for, dissident artists now. Because one of the things that we spoke about in the previous episode, sadly lost but not forgotten, right, was an attitude that I have seen by, many young dissidents, which is sort of a disdain for technique, right? This idea that, I am simply as I am, worthy of praise. So what do you think the relationship is between technique, right, the physical creative process, and the artistic merit itself, specifically as relates to dissidence? Because oftentimes you see, this sort of disdain for convention, which can be helpful, but oftentimes also that is sort of a crutch, right? That is a way to sidestep doing something difficult and to cast it as sort of a rebellion. So I realize it's quite a complicated question I threw at you, Alex.
Okay, right. So there's a lot there. So convention, yeah. So I think that we have the right has kind of like, it's got a sort of dichotomous view of technique and convention. So on one way, they want to sort of break down convention. They want to do something new. They want to make their mark. They want to be distinctive. Well, that's natural for every generation, and I think that's important, and that should be encouraged. And yet also you would also have, as part of this movement, as shall we say, a sort of an anti-status quo movement, which is composed of many different people with different views, different loyalties and different intentions in terms of art, in terms of aesthetics. So you've also got the super trad crowd who are saying, like basically, what we need to do is, if we could get everyone into apprenticeships, into old style ateliers, then people would learn their craft and they'd be more bonded to tradition and to the canon. And I do agree with that. I think that art schools have gone too far in the opposite way. So like when I was at art school, I wasn't actually taught a lot of art technique. A lot of it I had to pick up myself through research, or I would talk to the technicians, and the technicians would say, you've got to use this kind of resin, or you've got to use this kind of chisel with this kind of stone and whatever, and they'll give you technical advice. That the tutors, the artists came in and they gave advice, and they would talk about ideas and intentions and presentation and stuff like this. And it was all really, really useful and got your brain working. And they'd give you reading lists and stuff, and they were terrific like that. But they wouldn't, by and large, they wouldn't actually say, you got a problem with those two colors because these two, this one dries faster than this one, so that's why you're having trouble with this technical thing. So you wouldn't actually get much of that advice from your tutor. Now, I think what's really important is if we can get back to the idea of apprenticeships, this would be wonderful. But I think it's also wonderful for people who've got a certain kind of temperament. So I've recently been looking about and thinking about like outsider artists. Now, I know someone like Francis Bacon wasn't an outsider artist, but he never went to art school. And he carried through this sort of odd make-do attitude. I mean, he would use materials he weren't supposed to use. He would use, for example, he'd use aerosol paint. He'd work on the back of canvases. He'd use like letraset, which is like dry lettering, and he'd sort of rub it onto the canvas surface. He'd do all sorts of things that were quite unconventional. And that really freed him up, and that was exciting stuff. But of course, it's not going to work for all artists. So on one hand, you've got artists who need freedom, other artists who need an atelier system. And at the moment, it's really tricky to find a way for these artists to grow and get the grounding that they need. But we've also got this confusion that comes later on, like, what sort of art do we want? So in this book, in the new book, I talk about, well, we've got a problem. I don't think that trad is the way to go. I think you can do it if you want, and I respect you, but it's not for me. I don't think it's appropriate. I don't also think it's what the artists that you admire. I think that you've misunderstood those artists because they were developing and doing something new. Leonardo and Raphael were exciting because they were doing something new. They were adding an aspect of realism to something that was idealistic and very carefully composed, and there's lots of geometry and there's lots of sort of like faking of stuff. They're doing crazy lighting, they're doing really subtle things that but these were really innovative. And
I mean, probably the best example of that in my mind, right, is Caravaggio, who has an incredibly dynamic, and I realize the irony of talking about Caravaggio's lighting while I literally have blinding sun illuminating half my face. I plan to do that, by the way. But this very dramatic lighting, and also look, like, sure, he painted biblical scenes, but he was not trad, right? He was murdered in what seems to have been a dispute regarding prostitutes. If not, he certainly spent a lot of time around prostitutes.
On the run from the Pope's soldiers?
Yeah. He died on, I believe, in Malta, right? A bizarre figure.
He died of a fever while he was on the run from the Popes and there were various other people who were after him as well. Yeah, he was actually a murderer himself.
So point is, I think that this is actually an interesting discussion, right? Because, we draw a distinction, and weirdly enough, I'm not the biggest fan of Bath of Bronze Age pervert, but he makes an interesting distinction here about the difference between a conservative and a reactionary, quote unquote. And when we talk about the sort of kept dissidents, right? There's a bizarre sense in which they are conservatives, right? They are warriors for the status quo. Now they are left wing, right? They are fans of equality, but they are ultimately, right, more conservative than the conservatives, right? They are soldiers for the thing as it currently is. And so, when you talk about, reactionaries, people such as us, which well, it's sort of a weird mix, because it's in order to go forward, you have to go back, right? You have to kind of create this synthesis, right, of the eternal truths, of the sort of the things that we know to be true about humans through all times and all contexts. But I actually completely agree with you. And the term trad is largely useless, because it's okay, well, what is trad? It's well, depending on who you ask, it either means a fairly basic set of life choices that all humans throughout almost all of history have done, right? Is getting married trad? It's no, it's just what people do in every time other than the last 60 years, or is it, the kind of the more expansive definition? But I think that kind of reactionary mindset, which is look, both, we are not slaves to, the idea of progress. We are not slaves to, kind of the lies of, the boomer truth regime, whatever you want to call it. But at the same time, right, the answer to that is not to sort of ossify society, is not to, chase after, forms that have sort of done and gone. And you see this in the US with, the now Zoomer occupied government, right? That's what ZOG stands for, if you're wondering, by the way. With, guys my age, basically, posting Thomas Kincaid paintings from the DHS. And I understand the sentiment, right? The idea of, returning America to a previous instantiation is, given the current context, I understand why, right? I'm not counter signaling that. But the idea of, the future being kind of this maudlin 50s version, I mean, it's sickening and dead, right? It's returning to something that is gone by the wayside. And so when we talk about well, what sort of artists are we looking towards? Who are we looking for? It's kind of an interesting question. And honestly, what I consider to be one of the open questions facing us, because, when I look at the people in our sphere, I would consider good artists. Carl Dahl, who I mentioned in our previous discussion, a good fiction writer, John Slaughter, another one, right? It's I'm excited to see where, that creative energy goes, because when we talk about, the previous culture, right, it is running out of the physical rewards that enabled a previous generation of artists to live how they did. But let's also be honest, it is also the kind of cultural strength is dying, right? Those sort of tired memes photocopied again and again and again are losing their steam. And so we're in this bizarre situation where it's we're sort of tilting at windmills. We're debating things that were really hashed out when my parents were in diapers, but they're still around. And so it seems as if, right, this would be the time for, an artistic rebirth. And at least as of yet, it hasn't, happened, at least in an identifiable way. But sorry, Alex, you got me ranting. This is obviously an issue I think about quite a lot. But so I guess, what do you think of that kind of, synthesis between, the past and, the future as regards art? What do you think is a viable, right wing, but not necessarily trad artistic scene?
Well, what I would say is that Jonathan Bowden, an English intellectual, and who was a star on the New Right, that he had a passion for what he called reactionary modernism. So he talked about the men of 1914. So he talked about Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Wyndham Lewis, the sort of vorticist, futurist artist. And he pointed out that actually a lot of what we think of as progressive and left-wing in modernism was actually staked out early on by really reactionary figures, people who were in some ways very deeply conservative, but they wanted to express that conservatism through a new vital art. They wanted a new aesthetic that would continue the tradition and would break down the banality of realism, of Victorian salon painting, of I don't know, Henry James as a sort of classic novelist, of sort of omniscient narrator and so forth. Nothing against him, but there was that feeling that actually people in the dissident spheres should reclaim much of what was considered modernist, something that's considered antithetical to the reactionary outlook, or at least the conservative outlook. The reactionaries much more excited and engaged by modernism. And you find when things get stale, when things feel like they're getting dry and played out, you get a lot of people going to different sources. So they're going back to a primitive stage of their own culture. So you have Picasso going back to early Catalan sculpture from like the 10th century, the 12th century, really primitive, raw stuff that he could lift out and turn into new pictures. Then you also have people who were turning to the foreign. So you have the Impressionists who were grabbing hold of Japanese woodblock prints and doing some crazy things with diagonals and composition, and strong color juxtapositions and anti-realism things that they found in Japanese prints. And also, the futurists would say, well, we need a new aesthetic, and the aesthetic should be based on the machine. It should be based on speed. Speed is the new quality. We can incorporate that. We can make things exciting. And so I would say that's very much the way I'm looking at things. Like, I want to get that excitement, that edge. I don't want realism. I don't want knights in armor. I don't want, children picking apples in an orchard. I mean, it's fine. It's fine for you. It's not fine for me. I don't think it's a living, vital thing. I think you've got to be really careful about that. It just seems like, as you were talking about the 1950s, Americana of the 1950s. It's kind of got a glamour to it. It's got a real sort of heady atmosphere to it when you've seen the sort of degeneracy of everyday life. But that's not a way forward either. So something interesting that I've been involved with is something called the Fiume Gallery, up by Rachel Haywire in New York. So at the moment they're just doing events, but they're looking to become a full-time proper gallery, and they are espousing what they're calling national futurism. So this is something that is going to be reactionary form of art. It's going to be a right-leaning form of art, but it's going to be defiant and modern. It's going to incorporate things like goth culture and synth music and photography and futurist painting and so forth. And it's going to be sort of fuse this together and provide. I think it's a really kind of exciting project. I think we're going to see some interesting stuff appearing in Fiume Gallery through the sort of the futurist movement, because there's a British futurist movement and an American futurist movement, and I discuss the differences between them politically and aesthetically in an essay in the new book.
Which sounds quite interesting. I think buried in the sort of distinction between more trad and then, shall we say, like reactionary futurists is ultimately, I think, a disagreement about the purpose of art. And maybe you can build out on that. But one of the things I think is quite interesting is that for a relatively large portion of time, particularly in the West, art was not signed in the same way, right? That art was, purchased, there would be craftsmen involved in it, but there's no signature, right? Obviously, we see the birth of first the celebrity artist, right, working within a canon with, established symbols, and then a transition to art as kind of limitless self-expression, right? There is nothing off the table of what can be expressed or touched. It is simply an expression of, individual genius, one might say. And so I'm curious, right? What do you see as, again, I realize this is a hell of a question, but you're the guy who wrote a book on it, right? What is, the purpose of art, right? Maybe we can narrow it slightly more down to, as dissidents, but, even just as kind of people who exist in a culture.
Well, so you've got kind of a division on the right between those who see art as being to do with social cohesion, family values, the values of your people. And I think that's fair enough. Okay. But then you've also got people on the other side. Well, it serves the self. It's to do with self-expression. It's to do with touching something important in yourself, in turning yourself into a mouthpiece for the gods, for the traditions, that you are becoming a divine speaker, and that you are like a holy fool, that you are imbued with the qualities of speaking divinity, but you may be doing it in a way that's shocking or strange, or encompasses subjects and attitudes and approaches or imagery that people might find disquieting or even repellent. So you've got these really two different attitudes to what art is. And for me, the artist that I love perhaps more than anyone else is Edvard Munch, because he's a vitalist. And a vitalist, I would say, is someone who taps into the core aspects of what it is to be human. So the fact that we are tragically limited, that we are destined by biology and by fate and divinity even to suffer, to experience certain life events, and it's our part to approach those and to do as well in those as possible, but also to understand that suffering is part of that. And those life events are to be born, puberty, to grow up, to detach yourself from your parents, to fall in love, to get married, to be betrayed, to be jealous, to be a parent, to become old, suffer and die. And not all of us are going to live those things. And also thinking about something like Evola. So Evola said, that it's, that there are different courses, there are different paths that you take. And the most difficult path and the lesser traveled path, I don't know if he talked about the left-hand path and the right-hand path. I can't remember which one it was. But he talked about, not every person who is great and will contribute to society will follow the common path. This person will be an adventurer, he will be a priest, he will be a seer, he will be an artist. He will not have a family. He will not have children. He will not fight in wars, but he will do other things that are great for his people. And he will contribute, but he will be perhaps even an outcast in his own time. And that's something that I think about a lot. And and it's something that I see people struggling with all the time on our side.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. And when you talk about trad, it's sort of a difficult thing to discuss because, like, if you looked at me on paper, right, it's like, okay, married, young, religious extremist, right? All of those things, it is trad. But on the other hand, right, the idea, and I think one of the problems with, a lot of trad content is that it assumes that the, highest end for every man is as a husband and a father. And obviously, that is true in the sense that enough people need to do that for a civilization to continue. And the West has been brought to ruin by radically underemphasizing that as a role. But the problem is, and you even see this in, examples like St. Paul, right? That is not the call of everyone. And, in some cases, right, artists or, great thinkers or generals, it's like, well, that can be, either sort of an ancillary detail or a distraction to, a wider purpose. And so, for instance, you have the example of like Newton, which, okay, yeah, sure, Newton is like an nth percentile autist, right? Like perhaps the most autistic man to ever live. Which, by the way, one of my favorite details about Newton is he basically just gave up science and got really obsessed with cracking down on like fraudulent currency. Like he just went around, detecting the scourge of George Floyd, one might even imagine. But point is, that is an example of someone who did not reproduce, right? He did not have, any offspring. And yet he was still able to do something great. And that is certainly a minority of cases, right? To say that most people are not Isaac Newton is effective. Like it's obviously true. But at the same time, I think that there is, an over emphasis on that, where it is generally good advice. And for most people is an admirable thing. But fundamentally, there is a social utility to having, bizarre and eccentric artists and creatives, right? They do things for a culture that, aren't expressed in something as simple as, a TFR above 2 or, other things which we kind of focus on the internet quite often.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have your leaders, your priests, your prophets, your visionaries. They're going to be outside of society. Now, in some ways, of course, economically speaking, socially speaking, they're free riders. You've got to have a strong, prosperous, stable society. You've got to have people getting married and having children, but this isn't necessarily the role for the artist. An artist might be married and might have children, but he might not. And you can only support those free riders if you have a proper functioning society and people are basically following the rules and basically paying their taxes and basically doing their military service and stuff. But then, the people like Spengler say, as soon as you start getting that sort of settled civilization, you're reaching the summer, you're reaching the early autumn of your civilizational cycle. So yeah, it's a tricky one to balance. So you've also got this problem of purity, like social and personal purity. It's like, you can't look at this artist because he did this or he did that. And you're thinking, well, look, okay, you're looking for someone who's going to be a saint or someone who's going to be someone who might have led a very good life, but they might be a very boring life. It might be that they don't translate that into works of great art or great literature, things that get passed down. And you have all sorts of cases of, I love the writings of, William Burroughs. William Burroughs is very controversial. Lifelong junkie, criminal. There's the question of
referring to him as controversial is probably underselling it.
Wife tutor. I mean, at the very least.
Yeah, maybe she's asking for it. That is a joke, by the way.
YouTube demonetized. Do not watch. Channel blocked. Age restricted.
There is something. There is something there, and there is sort of a tension between the needs of power, the needs of a civilization, and the needs of a creative, right? That there is always this desire to expand the scope of what is acceptable, right? To transgress. But the problem is when that has been played to the nth degree, when there is effectively nothing left to transgress, not only have you sort of blown up society, but you've also made art extraordinarily boring. And so in a weird way, it's almost like in order for art to be good, they kind of need someone to oppress them, even just a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So I love the beats. I really enjoy some of Kerouac. I love Burroughs. I know Corso's got some good stuff. Ginsberg's got some good, and of course, they've got huge. I mean, they were doing all sorts of things that the right would say is sort of socially and morally compromised. Technically speaking, they're not wrong, but also they're doing something remarkable. But once that suddenly becomes and decadence has always been a minority pursuit usually happens at the edge of societies, or it's not talked about. It's the preserve, like pornography was the preserve of royalty or cardinals. They would have these fancy books with erotic engravings that would cost a lot, and they would have to be kept absolutely secret. And if any relatives found them, they would be burned and so forth. The books, not the people. So So there was always a question. There's always been this decadence, but there's always been a natural reticence about it, a natural sort of suppression of it, marginalisation of it. The problem is that when you take off the chains, and that becomes conventional, that becomes socially acceptable in a liberal society. Well, what do you then suddenly it becomes the norm. And how is the society supposed to function when stuff that was on the periphery, that was always sort of there but kind of suppressed or accepted, tacitly accepted, suddenly becomes a lifestyle choice, a legitimate lifestyle choice, which has to be not only accepted but actually celebrated by the state? Then we're seeing problems arising.
Yeah, and that's sort of an interesting thing as well, where, and it's difficult to do this deliberately, right? And maybe you could say this has, very much to do with kind of the life cycles of, a civilization, where you need a certain amount of that chaos on the margins in order to, to have a living society, to have something which is, generative and which produces great things. However, right, if that takes over, if that runs, wild, it obviously, burns through a society. And it's almost impossible to freeze that in motion, right? It seems as if there is sort of an entropic nature of it. And, once it starts, it starts. And it is sort of bizarre as well in our current situation, because you could look at it and say, oh, well, the decadence has run its course, right? We've gone as much of that as there is to do. And I mean, this is a stupid example, right? But when you look at the kind of like extreme, kind of like performative Satanism that's kind of big in like popular music now, I'm not talking like Satanic Panic stuff. I mean, like, there are a number of prominent artists like Lady Gaga, Lil Nas X, any number of these that have sort of gone to that well over and over again, kind of denigrating traditional symbols, and it's done, right? There's almost nothing, there's no more to be squeezed from that stone. And so in a bizarre way, it's like, it gets back to that, well, how do you be transgressive in a time of ultimate decadence? It's like, well, guess what, bucko? We're going back to, as you said, a previous version, right, of the culture, which is kind of uncomfortable.
Yeah. So, I mean, like in the past, you had Saturnalia, which was sort of like, it was an inversion. And you had the carnival, which was a ritual inversion. So for one day, the servant would be master and the master would be servant. So the master would be serving the servant for one day. And the idea was that you could have this inversion and it was permitted. But you didn't go too far. You didn't commit any crimes. You didn't like stab anyone. You didn't rape anyone. It was like it was a gentle inversion, and it was a chance for the underclass to enjoy superiority. They got a chance to be the master for a day, and it was something that they could treasure and look forward to every year. That they could get to lord it over their theoretical master. And, and there's always been an aspect of like allowing the Dionysic, go back to ancient Greece and through to Nietzsche and stuff. You've got this Dionysic aspect that comes out in the Bacchanal, in the drinking party, where you have the worship of Bacchus and you have people getting roaring drunk, and they have visions, they have crazy ideas, they have mad discussions, and a symposium was a drinking party, and you'd have, and this was an essential part of city life, at least city life in ancient Greece, that you would have these drinking parties, and the young apprentices and the great masters would drink and share these things, and when they would have wild times, and they would discuss ancient knowledge, and they would try to derive inspiration from Bacchus and the gods, who would speak through them when they had no ability, when they had lost some of their inhibitions and their conscience. And, you know, and that's always existed in every society. It's always been allowed out. But the problem is that when you say it's allowed out all the time, or, you know, it's very difficult. It changes the dynamics a lot. I think that because it was such a rare and special, and it's quite a restricted thing, there were quite a lot of rules about when it could happen and who could participate in it. That kind of compression and isolation and formalization of the chaos, of the excitement, that added something quite special to it. And we've lost that, because you can basically be a stoner, you can be a drunk, you can be a libertine, all you like, as long as you've got the money and you don't break too many rules. Having it the other way, the way it was in ancient societies, I think there's some form of ancient wisdom about the way they managed to control it and have it in a very limited form.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for coming on. I realize I did what I am somewhat want to do, which is to pepper you with random questions and get thoroughly distracted. But your book is quite good. I read a good bit of it, highly recommend it. I will make sure to link it down in the description, as well as your social media. Again, I'm really glad to have you on. Glad to have actually gotten through an episode without major technical difficulties. But other than, you know, the book and your X and Substack, is there anywhere else people can find you?
Yeah, so I'll run down. So it's alexanderadamsart.substack.com. That's the way you can find a lot of my writing. It's also a way of supporting what I do directly if you're not going to be buying a book, which I do recommend. You can follow me on Twitter with Adams Artist. Also, you'll be able to see some art of mine. There's going to be a group display of art in London coming up in October. It's going to be running from the 7th to the 12th of October. So you can follow that and find out where it is, what's going on. You can see some of the art. You can also get access to some of the interviews with the artists who are participating. And that's at Cudo Gallery. That's Cudo Gallery. So you'll find some new art by me there and new art by some really exciting artists, and you can decide whether or not we've found the right course for dissident art in general.
Well, of course, highly recommend all of those. Again, Alex, thank you so much. This was a ton of fun. As far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you want to listen to podcasts. If you want the episodes early and ad-free, you'll need to throw me a few bucks. You can do so on Substack, Gumroad, Patreon, or Subscribestar. Or you can check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Again, Alex, this was a ton of fun. And to everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.